Welcome to RumiNation, the podcast that offers practical solutions to the challenges in our industry. Hi, this is Chris Gwyn, and today I'm talking with Dr. Galen Ericksen. Dr. Ericksen has, for the last 20 years, has been teaching, researching, and supporting the feedlot industry through extension at the University of Nebraska. Since 2012, Dr. Ericksen has been the Nebraska Cattle Industry Professor of Animal Science. He's well known and well respected throughout the cattle industry. Dr. Ericksen has received numerous awards, including the AFIA Ruminant Nutrition Award and the Nebraska Cattle Research and Education Award, just to name a few. In excess of 150 published peer-reviewed research publications and over 400 extension reports. He's a wealth of knowledge. And so it's an honor to have Dr. Ericksen with us today to discuss the key management practices related to receiving cattle. Dr. Ericksen, welcome to RumiNation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Ericksen, recently you presented at the annual Jeff O. Beef Academy on the best management practices related to receiving cattle in reference likely to their nutrition. Could you summarize for our audience the key nutritional considerations and management considerations of receiving cattle?
Well, yeah, I think the first step is to classify cattle, which most producers do, into risk categories. So everybody normally assigns them a risk, and everybody kind of knows if those are newly weaned calves, maybe higher risk, little more health concerns likely coming in with those cattle, versus sort of the other extreme, which might be big yearlings coming off grass, different concerns with them. So Absolutely. I want to start there, I guess, with the big yearlings. Nutritional concerns are really, they know how to eat. They may come in hungry already because of transport and so on. So I argue that really what you do on those first few days with those cattle that know how to eat, that are lower risk, probably not a lot of health concerns. And so now you got to worry about acidosis, not getting too much grain in the diet on the first days, because some may really go after it and overeat, so to speak. And that's your biggest management concern, likely with big yearlings or lower risk cattle that are bunk broke, know how to eat well.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, and the opposite extreme is you can get calves in that maybe were weaned when they were put on the truck, and pretty high stress. We ship them distances, may have just gotten shots, may not have had the vaccinations yet. So you see there's a whole lot of different concerns with them. But from a nutritional perspective, then with them is different management things that you can do. Number one is there's good evidence that actually more forage in the diet helps with animal health. Now, the dilemma there is that while more forage in the diet helps with animal health, it tends to also then limit some of their growth potential for those that are doing just fine. So there's a bit of a trade-off, I would say, when these higher risk calves that have more health concerns come in, more forage, a little better health outcomes potential, more forage, maybe a little less gain, a little poorer conversion. So again, it's a balance of where do we pick the right kind of energy levels in the diet and forage levels. So those are probably my first comments relative to what are the considerations, and then we can discuss details on what some of those other things would look like when you want to get specific diets. But those are my key recommendations.
Yeah, so absolutely. So classifying the calves, and then just trying to, I guess there's some trade-offs to give on those lighter weight, higher risk cattle. Do we optimize health and give up a bit of performance? So this is the balance and the trade-offs people make between the growth, the diet adaptation, perhaps immune function coming into place, and economics. So what do you recommend to producers on how to meet that balance? Is it farm to farm, or is there
No, I think there's a starting point. The probably the way to manage that is most receiving diets are going to be roughly 35 to 45% forage in the diet. If we're feeding and delivering milled complete rations, right? That's my assumption here. Okay. So I think a good starting point is about 35 to 40% forage. And that forage likely needs to be pretty high quality forage. Many times, if you're going to feed alfalfa hay in your operation, and a higher quality alfalfa hay, that's a good time to be targeting that. And then you got about 2/3 of the diet then that's remaining. Here in the Midwest, in states like Nebraska, it's common for us to feed wet byproducts, wet distillers grains, wet corn gluten feeds, and those are excellent components of the diet. So a lot of our receiving diets are about 1/3 wet distillers grains or 1/3 wet corn gluten feed. And the benefits of that is it's a fibrous byproduct, so you don't have to worry about the acidosis concerns. It adds moisture, which helps cut down on dust and holds the diet together. And they're extremely palatable, so calves really go after it. And then the remainder of the diet, we got about 1/3 left, or a little less. That would likely usually be made up of things like dry rolled corn or barley or your grain sources in that case. A couple of key things though, you want to avoid fermented feeds, especially for cattle that aren't bunk broke or know how to eat out of the bunk, or maybe not exposed to those fermented feeds. So we limit usually corn silage or other silages that are fermented. And we usually limit high moisture corn or high moisture grains, again, because they've gone through an ensiling process. Fine to introduce those, but I would introduce those later. So back to your question, the trade-off is if I put in 50 or 60% forage in the diet, may help my health outcomes, but the cattle are going to gain less and convert poor. If I go too low on forage, you're going to run the risk of acidosis and likely won't help your health outcomes. So that's the trade-off. I think the magic is somewhere in that 35 to 45% forage. But the other comment I'd make is if you know the cattle are hungry, usually a common procedure is to feed some hay on arrival. Probably all cattle have been exposed to hay at some point in their life, and or it mimics what they came off of. So those are some of the simple, I guess, easy recommendations that help with managing this balance between health and optimizing performance. Once their cattle are received for a few weeks and you look like your health outcomes are improving and the cattle are settling down, then you can start worrying about, I think, increasing energy content and getting better performance.
So you mentioned a few weeks. What are people doing differently in the length of receiving period? Does it
Well,
vary
there
on?
again, I think with, a lot of times I think people are staging that around if they're going to bring cattle in for revaccinations. That's usually a 2 to 3 week type time frame. But I would encourage producers to be a little patient, especially if they're high risk calves. You don't want to be impatient and shorten that receiving period much below a few weeks. It's better to get them healthy and then worry about getting the best performance on them, I would argue, for those higher risk calves and naive calves that haven't been into a yard or a backgrounding situation. But if they are low risk and they come in and they're yearlings or preconditioned calves that are already bunk broke, you can certainly shorten that receiving period to less than a week even, and then start stepping them up if that's your desire.
Yeah. So that sounds like some of the cornerstones of the forage quality, the percent of forage, good quality forage in that diet, and then understanding the type of cattle that you have and therefore how you can push them along. Are there any other key points that a producer should be reminding themselves of?
Well, then I guess I'd bring up two other comments relative to success and other things that have been tried. If you have access to pasture, which a lot of feed yards and backgrounding yards may not have that blessing, but if you do and you have pastures close to you, or maybe you've planted cover crops on acres close to you that you're planning to graze, we have good evidence from the University of Nebraska, and others have researched this too, that if I can get those cattle in, run them through and process them if you want to vaccinate them, but then kick them back out into a grazing situation, we've seen health concerns basically cut in half.
Wow.
So we had a couple of years of different incidences of health pulls. 1 year it went from 53% down to 23% pulls. Now you might argue, well, we just didn't do a good job of pulling cattle on pasture and we missed them. But based on death loss and how those cattle did after that, we didn't miss them on pasture. I do in fact believe that's evidence of some of the nutritional stress of bringing calves into a new environment versus kicking them back out on the pasture. Now, in fairness, the calves out on pasture didn't gain as well for that first 28-day period, but again, I think it's better to get them healthy, then you can worry about the performance. The second comment I'd make is lots of products and other nutritional recommendations are made for receiving calves. A lot of products proposed to help with immune function and keeping calves healthy. And some of those work, and of course some of those don't work. And so it's always a question of sorting out what strategies do you want to try, what feed additives do you want to use and have good success with. My recommendation as always is just base that on good sound science and research data that support the use of those. And again, some of those additives work and then we have evidence that some don't help much. But I think it's critical to first and foremost get your base diets right. And then you can start worrying about additional things to add and fortify in your diet to try and help health. But just make sure that's based on good data and sound research evidence.
Makes a lot of sense. Good biology, good data, good research, and positioning products where they're the highest ROI, most benefit. Hey,
Yep.
back to your study on the pasture access. So you perhaps gave up a little bit of gain. Were you able to look at those cattle right through finish, and how did they do?
Yeah, that's one of the challenges in receiving or health research, to be honest, is that many times, including here at the University of Nebraska, we bring calves in and you bring 1,000 head in, you do a nice research receiving study, and then at day 30, when it's done, they go in different directions. We don't follow them through. We have, in some cases, to answer your question directly, in those pasture studies, we did not follow those on through and based on their previous treatment. In other receiving studies we have, but that's a fair point and a good point for people to always be looking at is, are there carryover effects? Because we did do a study with a feed additive at receiving, a yeast product, and there was good evidence that it helped with receiving. Then we followed those cattle all the way through, and at the end, there wasn't a lot of difference. We improved health outcomes a little bit early on, got a little more gain, and then at the end, they all kind of finished the same. So it is good a question to ask is, what's the carryover effect of anything you do in that first few weeks, and does it help?
Pretty important if you're the one responsible for the economics of those finished cattle, right?
Yep.
If you may, just because it's an intriguing study, and I was going to ask about bunk space and lying space, and on your pasture study, do you think that played a role of just having more access to feed all the time for those calves?
Yeah, perhaps. I think it's more about them being one. It could be that they're spread out, so our space per head, right, is much greater on a pasture system than in a pen system. To give some detail, those were 9-acre pastures, so they're not sections of land or huge areas. They're smaller research paddocks, but they do certainly have more space and can spread out and graze. So I don't know if it's getting them spread out, if it's the fact that they're used to grazing and you put them back into a grazing situation, at least for a little bit. The bunk space question's good. In our case, we usually allow 18 inches or more. Sorry, I don't have that in metric. 18 inches or more in bunk space for those receiving calves, because we don't want to short them.
Yeah.
And that's another key consideration, I think, for producers when they first bring in cattle. We're limiting them some, maybe when we deliver feed in that first week. So you want to make sure that all of them, if they want to eat, have access to come up and eat at the time of feeding. Limit feeding them is also a good way to maybe check the cattle. If I'm keeping those cattle hungry, and my feed truck comes along, feeds, I always argue either the person who's checking the cattle should be driving the truck, so they're actually looking at the cattle and checking which ones are not eating, or the person checking cattle needs to be right behind the feed truck, because the ones that don't come up might be the first candidates to be checking out closer for health concerns. So I think that Bunk space is important. I don't think we limited them at all in our studies that we had here, but that is a risk in commercial situations. So I think the recommendation is 18 inches of bunk space. And then, of course, we crowd them in greater when we start them up on feed and finishing.
That makes sense. Good practical tips. So with that in mind, take home messages for the audience today.
I think get your risk categories right based on your previous experiences. Producers know well what kind of cattle they're buying, and they have a better feel for that than anyone. So if you think those cattle are low risk, probably watch your forage level when they first come in. Maybe fill them up on forage so they don't overeat on grain, and then you can be pretty aggressive with those cattle. Higher risk calves, I think you want to pay a little more attention to forage and diet. And if you've had some challenges with health at your operation and the groups of cattle you're buying, you might consider feeding more forage than what you've been doing. Make sure it's good, high quality forage. And then get those diets right, then start exploring feed additives and other ways to improve your health outcomes. Last comment I'd make is base your decisions on good, sound science and recommendations. Get help if you need it for advice on these nutritional recommendations. And then I think once they're healthy, then you worry about getting the optimum performance and the best performance out of those calves.
Makes a lot of sense. So thank you again for sharing your knowledge and experience and your research with the audience of RumiNation today. So thank you again, Dr. Ericksen.
My pleasure. Happy to help.
And I really want to thank the audience for listening in to us so that you don't miss the next episode of RumiNation Podcasts. Check us out at jeffo.ca. We're also available on Apple and Google Podcast and Spotify. This podcast was brought to you by Jeffo Nutrition, precision nutrition for a growing world.